Sleep is the cousin of death, but dreams are the waiting room of the damned. I gripped the edges of the porcelain bathroom sink until my knuckles turned completely bone white, staring at my bloodshot, violently trembling reflection in the cracked mirror. The fluorescent bulb above me flickered, casting deep, bruised shadows under my eyes. I had not slept in 4 days. The absolute, paralyzing terror of closing my eyes had completely hijacked my nervous system. If I slept, the doorway opened. If I slept, they would pull me back down into the dark. I could still hear my mother's old music box playing that haunting, slow lullaby in the back of my mind, a rhythmic, mechanical melody that now felt like a funeral march. I refused to go back to the realm of the dead, but to understand how I became a permanent prisoner of my own subconscious, you have to understand the agonizing tragedy that tore my reality apart. I lived in a suffocating, gray industrial town called Slag Creek, Ohio, a place permanently choked by the exhaust of heavy steel mills and the freezing rain of the Rust Belt. I lived in a cramped, 2-story row house with my older brother, Gideon, and our elderly mother, Mabel. She was the anchor of our fragile lives. It started on a freezing Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee, when I heard a sickening, heavy thud from the hallway. I vaulted out of my chair and sprinted into the corridor. Mabel was on the floor, clutching her knee, her face pale and drawn tight with pain. She had slipped on the worn linoleum. "Ma!" I gasped, dropping to my knees and gently lifting her shoulders. "Gideon, get in here." Gideon rushed down the stairs, his face instantly draining of color. "I'm getting the keys. We are taking you to the emergency room right now." "Absolutely not," Mabel grimaced, weakly swatting my hand away as she forced herself up against the wall. "It's just a bruised knee. I am not spending 6 hours in a waiting room to have a doctor tell me I'm old. I will put a cold compress on it, and the good Lord will handle the rest of the healing." "Ma, please, you need to let a doctor look at this," I pleaded, the anxiety gnawing at my stomach. "Donovan, stop fussing," she scolded softly, though her voice was strained. She patted my cheek with a freezing, trembling hand. "You worry entirely too much about me. You need to start worrying about yourself. Specifically, you need to find a wife so you stop treating your mother like glass." Gideon chuckled nervously, helping her to the sofa. "She's right, Don. You need to ask Jolene out. You've been staring at her across the accounting floor for 6 months. If you don't make a move, you're going to die a lonely old man in this miserable town." I rolled my eyes, feeling a flush of heat in my cheeks, completely unaware that this mundane, domestic morning would be the last shred of normalcy I would ever experience. An hour later, I was sitting under the depressing, buzzing fluorescent lights of the Sterling and Vance accounting firm. The air in the office was stale, smelling of ozone from the massive Xerox machines and cheap burnt coffee. I was a senior clerk, spending my days drowning in endless rows of financial ledgers. My coworker, Garrett, frantically rushed over to my cubicle, holding a corrupted floppy disk. "Donovan, please tell me you know how to bypass the encryption on the quarterly tax files. I am locked out, and Sterling is going to literally fire me if I don't have this printed in 10 minutes. I sighed, took the disk, and quickly ran a bypass script I had written to recover the data. "You owe me lunch for a week, Garrett." Before Garrett could thank me, the heavy oak door of the corner office opened. Mr. Sterling, a massive, intimidating man with a permanent scowl, stepped out and pointed a thick finger directly at me. "Donovan, my office, now." My stomach dropped. I walked into the oppressive, wood-paneled room, expecting to be reprimanded for bypassing the security protocols. Instead, Sterling tossed a heavy manila folder onto his desk. "You carried Garrett's team through the entire audit season," Sterling said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I don't reward laziness, but I do reward efficiency." "Open it." I opened the folder. It was a completely rewritten contract. A massive promotion to senior auditor, complete with a salary I had never even dreamed of seeing in Slag Creek. "Congratulations, Donovan," Sterling muttered. "Don't make me regret it." I left the office floating on air. I could finally move Mabel out of the drafty row house. I could finally afford a place in the suburbs. I couldn't wait to see the pride in her eyes. That night, the freezing Ohio rain battered the thin windows of the row house. I sat on the edge of my bed, showing the contract to Mabel. She was smiling, but she looked impossibly exhausted. Her skin was a translucent, sickly gray, and she kept rubbing her chest beneath her thick wool sweater. "I'm so proud of you, Donovan," she whispered, her voice incredibly weak. "You have such a good heart. But money isn't everything. You need someone to share it with." "Ma, please, not the Jolene speech again." I laughed softly. "I won't be here forever, Donovan," Mabel said, her eyes suddenly turning incredibly dark and serious. The ambient temperature in the bedroom seemed to plummet. "I need to know you won't be alone in the dark. You're going to be here a long time, Ma," I promised, pulling the blankets up to her chin. "Get some sleep. We'll talk about Jolene tomorrow." She nodded, her eyes fluttering shut. I turned off the bedside lamp, completely oblivious to the horrific truth that tomorrow was a promise the universe had no intention of keeping. I fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, and then the nightmares began. I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. I was standing in the freezing, torrential downpour of the St. Jude Catholic Cemetery on the edge of town. The sky was an unnatural, bruised shade of violet. Mabel was walking ahead of me on the muddy, winding path between the towering granite tombstones. She wasn't limping. She moved with a strange, gliding motion. "Ma, what are we doing out here in the rain?" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the deafening roar of the storm. Mabel stopped in front of a massive, rusted iron mausoleum. She didn't turn around. "The souls in this dirt are just waiting, Donovan," Mabel whispered. Her voice didn't come from her mouth. It echoed directly inside the center of my skull, vibrating against my brain tissue. "They are trapped in the dark, waiting for judgment. That is why you must always pay your respects when you pass the dead. If you don't acknowledge them, they get jealous. They will latch onto your warmth, and they will drag you down to keep them company." "Ma, you're scaring me. Let's go home," I pleaded, reaching out to grab her shoulder. But as my hand closed around her heavy wool sweater, she violently dissolved into a thick, putrid cloud of black ash. The ash blew into my face, choking me, filling my lungs with the suffocating stench of rotting meat and wet earth. "Ma!" I shrieked, violently thrashing in the dark. My eyes snapped open. I gasped for air, expecting to see the familiar ceiling of my bedroom. Instead, I was staring at a blindingly bright, sterile white light. The heavy, chemical smell of bleach and rubbing alcohol flooded my nostrils. I wasn't in my bed. I was sitting in the cold plastic chair of the Slag Creek Memorial Hospital waiting room. Gideon was sitting next to me. His face was buried in his hands, his shoulders violently shaking as he wept uncontrollably. "Gideon," I choked out, a wave of absolute, paralyzing dread crashing over my heart. "Where is she? Where is Ma?" Gideon looked up at me, his eyes completely bloodshot, his face shattered by an unspeakable grief. "She had a massive aneurysm in her sleep," Dawn. By the time I heard her gasping and called the ambulance, she was already gone. We lost her. The world completely violently stopped. The promotion, the future, my entire reality shattered into a million irreparable pieces on the sterile linoleum floor of that hospital. The next 3 weeks were a hollow, agonizing blur of absolute despair. The funeral was a miserable affair in the freezing rain. After we lowered her heavy wooden casket into the mud of St. Jude Cemetery, a profound, deafening silence took over the row house. I returned to the accounting firm, but I was a ghost. I didn't speak to Garrett. I didn't look at Jolene. I just stared blindly at the financial ledgers, utterly consumed by a rotting, suffocating guilt. I should have taken her to the hospital when she slipped. I should have saved her. My sanity began to rapidly fracture. I could not accept that she was permanently gone. On the 21st night after her funeral, driven completely mad by grief, I drove my sedan to St. Jude Cemetery at 2 in the morning. The graveyard was pitch black, suffocated by a thick, freezing fog. I walked blindly through the rows of granite stones until I reached the fresh mound of overturned, muddy earth. I dropped to my knees in the wet dirt, sobbing hysterically. I dug my bare fingers into the freezing mud, desperately wishing I could pull her back up to the surface. "Ma, I'm so sorry," I wept, pressing my forehead against the cold soil. "Please come back. I can't do this without you." And then, from beneath 6 feet of packed, heavy mud, a voice answered me. "Donovan." It was a wet, gurgling, suffocated whisper, muffled by the earth, but it was undeniably her voice. I violently recoiled, scrambling backward across the mud in sheer, unadulterated terror. My heart hammered so hard against my ribs I thought it was going to physically shatter my sternum. "You shouldn't be out here talking to the dirt, boy." I spun around. Standing behind me in the freezing fog, holding a flickering kerosene lantern, was Abram, the ancient, weathered groundskeeper of St. Jude. His face was deeply scarred, his eyes pale and milky, seeing far beyond the physical world. "She spoke to me?" I gasped, pointing a violently shaking finger at the grave. "I heard her. She's down there." Abram shook his head slowly, the lantern casting terrifying, dancing shadows across the tombstones. "She ain't down there, son. Her shell is down there. Her soul is trapped in the waiting room, the in-between. I need to see her," I begged, crawling toward his heavy leather boots, completely abandoning all reason. "Please, there has to be a way. I just need to tell her I'm sorry." Abram stared down at me, a profound, terrifying pity in his pale eyes. "There is an old way," Abram rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves grinding against stone. "An old, forbidden rite, the Somnus ritual. I can give you the incantation to project your consciousness into the astral waiting room while you sleep. You can meet her in the dream realm. Give it to me," I demanded, desperate beyond words. Abram leaned down, his face inches from mine, the smell of formaldehyde and cheap tobacco pouring off his breath. "Listen to me very carefully, Donovan. This is not a game. The things that wander the dream realm do not have physical bodies. They are starving. If you open the door to that world, you must ritually cleanse your physical flesh with holy water and salt before you sleep. If you carry any spiritual impurity, the parasitic entities waiting in the dark will smell your grief, and they will use your dreams to hijack your physical body." I locked myself in the freezing bathroom of the row house, the heavy wooden door bolted shut against my brother, Gideon, who was pounding on the other side, begging me to come out. I ignored him. My mind was completely consumed by the desperate, burning need to see my mother again. I stripped down to my bare skin, shivering violently in the damp, drafty air. I filled the chipped porcelain bathtub with freezing water and dumped 3 massive cartons of coarse sea salt into it, just as Abram the groundskeeper had instructed. Cleanse the flesh, purify the anchor. I submerged my entire body into the freezing brine, the salt violently stinging the microabrasions on my skin. I held a small, crumpled piece of parchment Abram had given me, completely covered in a jagged, archaic script. My teeth were violently chattering, but I forced my jaw steady. Exi de tenebris, I chanted, my voice echoing off the mildewed tiles. Per vila menane, ostend mihi animus in atrius expectationis. The absolute second the final syllable left my mouth, the freezing water in the bathtub felt as though it turned into solid, suffocating concrete. My lungs seized. My heart gave one massive, agonizing thud against my sternum and completely stopped beating. The sensation of my soul violently tearing itself away from my physical nervous system was excruciating. It felt like heavy, rusted fishing hooks were embedded in my spine, violently ripping my consciousness upward. My physical body slumped beneath the freezing water, completely paralyzed, while my spirit was aggressively dragged into the astral abyss. I opened my eyes. I was no longer in the bathroom. I was standing in the center of a terrifying, surreal mirror version of Slag Creek. The sky was an infinite, oppressive void of swirling gray ash. The buildings were decaying, warped at sickening angles, completely devoid of color or warmth. The silence was absolute, a deafening vacuum that felt heavy enough to crush my skull. I stood in the dilapidated living room of our row house. The walls were rotting, weeping thick streams of black sludge. Sitting on the faded floral sofa, looking exactly as she did the day she died, was Mabel. "Ma!" I sobbed, the overwhelming, shattering grief violently erupting from my chest. I lunged forward and threw my arms around her neck, but she didn't feel warm. She felt like cold, hard marble. "Donovan," Mabel whispered, her voice laced with a profound, agonizing sorrow. "You shouldn't be here. You are completely exposed." I pulled back, tears streaming rapidly down my face. "I had to see you, Ma. I'm so sorry. I should have saved you. I can't live in that house without you." As a heavy tear fell from my cheek and landed directly onto Mabel's translucent wrist, a horrifying, sickening sizzle echoed in the quiet room. Mabel shrieked in absolute, blinding agony. The spot where my tear had touched her skin was violently burning, melting through her spiritual flesh like concentrated sulfuric acid. Thick, black smoke poured from the wound as she desperately clutched her arm, retreating backward across the rotting floorboards. "Ma, what did I do?" I gasped, horrified, reaching out for her. "Stay back," Mabel commanded, her voice overlapping with a terrifying, ethereal echo. "Your grief is a poison here, Donovan. The tears of the living act as battery acid on the souls of the dead. Every single time you mourn me, every time you cry in that house, I physically burn in the dark. I am in agony." I froze, completely paralyzed by the horrific realization that my depression was actively torturing her soul. "I didn't know." I wept, desperately trying to wipe the remaining tears from my face, terrified of hurting her again. "You have to let me go," Mabel pleaded, her milky eyes wide with desperation. "This is not your world. You have an open, bleeding doorway in your mind right now. The parasitic things in the dark can smell your pulse. You need to go back. Take care of Gideon. Promise me, Donovan. Promise me you will stop crying." "I promise," I choked out, forcing my chaotic, breaking heart to completely harden. I won't shed another tear. I swear to God. Go, she screamed, as the shadows in the corners of the room began to violently writhe and stretch toward me. My consciousness was violently yanked backward, sucked through a suffocating, freezing vortex of pure darkness. My physical eyes snapped open. I burst out of the freezing salt water in the bathtub, violently gasping for air, coughing up lungs full of brine. The bathroom door was suddenly kicked open. Gideon rushed in, his face pale with panic, holding a heavy wrench. When he saw me sitting in the tub, shivering but entirely alive, he dropped the tool. "Donovan, what the hell is wrong with you?" Gideon roared. "You've been locked in here for 2 hours. I thought you drowned." I looked up at him. The crushing, suffocating weight of the past 3 weeks was completely gone. I had seen her. I knew she was safe, and I knew what I had to do to keep her from burning. I started to laugh. It was a manic, breathless, unhinged sound. "She's okay, Gideon," I beamed, stepping out of the freezing water. "I saw her. She told me to move on. I'm going to be perfectly fine." Gideon stared at me, deeply unsettled by my erratic shift in mood, but he didn't argue. He was just relieved I wasn't dead. The next morning, I walked into the Sterling and Vance accounting firm wearing a pressed suit, my hair combed, my shoulders back. I felt an unnatural, vibrating hum of energy under my skin. I walked straight past Garrett's cubicle and stopped directly at Jolene's desk. Jolene looked up, her bright green eyes widening in surprise. "Donovan, you look really good today." "I feel good, Jolene," I smiled, leaning against the partition. "I know I've been a ghost lately, but I want to change that. Let me take you to the Copper Diner tonight. 7 o'clock. My treat." A beautiful, warm smile spread across her face. "I would love that, Donovan." That evening, the Copper Diner was packed, smelling heavily of fried onions and black coffee. Jolene and I were sitting in a red vinyl booth near the back. The conversation was flowing effortlessly. For the first time in a month, I felt a genuine spark of human connection. I was fulfilling my promise to Mabel. I was living, but Abram the groundskeeper had warned me, if you open the door to that world, the things in the dark will use your dreams to hijack your physical body. What Abram failed to mention was that once the doorway was propped open, the line between sleeping and waking would begin to violently bleed. I was taking a sip of my coffee when the ambient temperature in the diner suddenly plummeted. My breath plumed into a thick white cloud of vapor. The loud, chaotic chatter of the diner instantly went dead silent. The jukebox cut off in the middle of a song. I looked around. Every single patron in the diner was completely frozen, trapped in a terrifying, suspended animation. "Jolene?" I asked, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic rhythm. Jolene wasn't looking at me. She was staring in absolute, paralyzed horror at the empty space beside our booth. I slowly turned my head. Standing in the aisle was a towering, heavily muscled man. He was wearing a filthy, blood-soaked mechanic's jumpsuit. The left side of his skull was completely crushed inward, exposing gray brain matter and jagged shards of white bone. His eyes were entirely black, weeping thick, dark blood. "You are touching my wife," the rotting entity hissed, his voice a metallic, guttural scrape that vibrated my teeth. "Who are you?" I shouted, scrambling backward against the vinyl booth. "She is mine," the dead man roared. He lunged forward with terrifying, supernatural speed. His massive, freezing hands violently clamped down around my throat. Couldn't breathe. The stench of rotting meat and motor oil flooded my lungs. I thrashed wildly, desperately grabbing at his wrists, trying to pry his crushing grip off my windpipe. "Get off me," I gurgled, throwing a violent punch directly into the dead man's face. Suddenly, the deafening noise of the diner violently snapped back into existence. The jukebox blared, plates clattered. The rotting man instantly vanished. But my hands were not grabbing empty air. I blinked, the supernatural hallucination shattering, and realized the absolute horrifying reality of what I was doing. I was standing over the diner table. My hands were violently wrapped around Jolene's throat. I was actively choking her. Jolene was thrashing beneath me, her face turning a terrifying shade of purple, her fingernails frantically clawing at my wrists, weeping in sheer, unadulterated terror. Several men from the counter were already sprinting toward our booth, shouting for me to let her go. I gasped, violently ripping my hands away as if her skin was made of hot iron. Jolene collapsed against the table, coughing violently, gasping for oxygen, sobbing uncontrollably. "Jolene! Oh my God, Jolene! I'm so sorry!" I shrieked, backing away in sheer panic. "I didn't mean to. There was a man. He was wearing a mechanic's suit. He had a crushed skull. He said you were his wife." Jolene froze, her tear-streaked face looking up at me with an expression of profound, absolute horror. "How do you know about Declan?" she whispered, her voice completely broken. "Declan was my husband. He was crushed under a hydraulic lift at the auto shop a year ago. I never told anyone at the firm." I stared at her, the blood draining completely from my face. I hadn't just hallucinated. The Somnus ritual had completely destroyed the barrier in my mind. I was a walking, breathing radio antenna for the dead, and the violently jealous spirit of her deceased husband had just used my physical body to try and murder her. "Stay away from me!" Jolene screamed, scrambling out of the booth and running toward the kitchen. I didn't wait for the men from the counter to tackle me. I bolted out the glass door of the diner, sprinting into the freezing Ohio rain, completely consumed by an overwhelming, catastrophic dread. The nightmare escalated with terrifying speed. My row house became a purgatory. I refused to sleep, but my exhausted brain started forcing microsleeps upon me while I was fully awake. The dead realized that I was an open conduit, and they began swarming me like starving animals to a fresh kill. 3 days after the diner incident, I was standing in my kitchen when the room violently shifted. The cabinets rotted away. A man severely burned in an industrial chemical fire appeared in the center of the room. His flesh completely melted to his bones. "Tell my wife," the burning entity gurgled, grabbing my shoulders with scalding, phantom hands. "The bank locker is 409. Tell her the money is in locker 409. They are going to foreclose on the house." The visions were relentless. Murder victims, suicide cases, people who died trapped in the dark. They all violently shoved their way into my subconscious, hijacking my vocal cords, demanding I deliver their final messages. I was living 2 completely separate lives simultaneously. My physical body began to rapidly deteriorate. I lost 15 pounds. My hair started falling out in clumps. Sleep was no longer a state of rest. It was a terrifying, violent battleground where parasitic entities actively fought to possess my empty shell. On the 8th day, I reached my absolute breaking point. I collapsed on the living room floor, my physical brain completely shutting down due to severe sleep deprivation. I plunged instantly into the deepest, darkest layer of the astral realm. I was standing in the center of a beautiful, sunlit church. Jolene was walking down the aisle in a pristine white wedding dress. I smiled, feeling a brief, impossible wave of peace. But as I reached out to take her hand, her face violently decayed into a rotting skull. The doors of the church exploded inward. Declan, the dead mechanic, sprinted down the aisle, holding a massive, rusted steel wrench. "I told you she is mine," Declan roared, bringing the heavy steel down directly onto my kneecap. In the physical world, my brother Gideon had just returned home from his shift at the steel mill. He found me violently convulsing on the living room rug, screaming in absolute, guttural agony, clutching my leg. "Donovan!" Gideon yelled, dropping his lunchbox and pinning my thrashing arms to the floor. "Donovan, wake up!" But I couldn't wake up. I was completely trapped behind the veil. Gideon frantically dialed the emergency clinic. 20 minutes later, Dr. Aris, a seasoned, exhausted local physician, burst through our front door with his medical bag. "He's been convulsing for 20 minutes. He won't open his eyes." Gideon panicked, holding my head to prevent me from cracking my skull against the floorboards. Dr. Aris quickly checked my vitals. His heart rate is dangerously high. He is trapped in a severe, violent night terror. If we don't chemically suppress his nervous system, he's going to suffer a massive cardiac arrest right here on the floor. Dr. Aris pulled a syringe from his bag, filling it with a heavy dose of liquid benzodiazepine. "No, wait," Gideon argued, sensing something was profoundly wrong. But it was too late. Dr. Aris plunged the needle directly into my thigh, injecting the heavy, chemical sedative directly into my bloodstream. It was the worst possible thing he could have done. The sedative did not wake me up. It completely, entirely severed the fragile, physical anchor tethering my soul to my body. In the astral realm, the church completely dissolved. Declan dissolved. I fell backward into a bottomless, freezing void of pure, suffocating darkness. My physical body on the living room floor instantly went completely limp. The violent thrashing stopped. My breathing slowed to a terrifying, shallow rattle. My eyes rolled back, remaining half open and completely unresponsive. "Donovan," Gideon whispered, shaking my shoulders. "His vitals are dropping rapidly," Dr. Aris panicked, checking my pupils with a penlight. "He isn't waking up. He's slipping into a deep comatose state. Call an ambulance immediately. We are losing him." As the distant wail of the ambulance sirens echoed through the freezing streets of Slag Creek, I was falling deeper and deeper into the astral abyss. The dead were waiting for me at the bottom, and this time, they had absolutely no intention of letting me leave. The heavy, chemical sedative that Dr. Aris injected into my thigh did not bring me peace. It completely annihilated the fragile, silver tether that kept my soul anchored to my physical flesh. I was violently plunged into the absolute, crushing depths of the astral abyss. There was no light. There was no sound. There was only a freezing, suffocating vacuum and the terrifying, undeniable sensation of being surrounded by thousands of starving, invisible predators. I was completely paralyzed, floating in a purgatory of pure, unadulterated darkness. But I was not entirely cut off from the physical world. The Somnus ritual had permanently destroyed the barrier in my mind, leaving me in a horrifying state of dual consciousness. I was trapped in the spiritual void, but through the bleeding veil, I could hear the faint, distorted echoes of the Slag Creek Memorial Hospital Intensive Care Unit. The rhythmic, mechanical beep of my own heart monitor sounded like a distant, dying submarine sonar. "His brain activity is plummeting." Dr. Aris's voice echoed through the dark, sounding muffled, as if he were speaking underwater. "I don't understand it. The sedative should have just relaxed his nervous system, but it's like his consciousness has completely evacuated his body." Gideon, you need to prepare yourself. If he doesn't emerge from this comatose state within the next 12 hours, his brainstem will suffer irreversible necrotic damage. We are going to lose him. No! Gideon's voice cracked with absolute, shattered desperation. He was hallucinating. He was talking about the St. Jude Cemetery. He told me he saw our mother in the bathroom. He spoke to the groundskeeper. I could feel the physical weight of Gideon grabbing my limp, comatose shoulders in the hospital bed. He opened a door. Dr. Eris. Gideon shouted, his panic reaching a fever pitch. Medicine isn't going to wake him up. Something else has him. You keep him on that ventilator. I am going to get the man who did this to him. In the astral void, the temperature suddenly dropped to absolute zero. They had finally found me. The parasitic entities that wandered the waiting room of the dead realized that my soul was completely untethered. They realized my physical body in the hospital bed was now an empty, breathing vessel, a vacant house with the front door left wide open. Dozens of rotting, disfigured silhouettes began to violently manifest in the darkness around me. I saw the burned man from my kitchen. I saw the weeping, faceless victims of violent crimes. And leading the horde, holding his heavy, rusted steel wrench, was Declan, the dead mechanic. The flesh is empty, Declan hissed, his crushed skull weeping thick, black blood. Take the anchor. Consume the boy. The horde violently swarmed me. Freezing, phantom hands aggressively tore at my spiritual form, desperately trying to rip my soul to shreds so they could hijack my physical body. The agony was indescribable. A blinding, tearing sensation that felt like my very essence was being ground through a heavy industrial meat grinder. Couldn't scream, couldn't fight back. I was completely defenseless. Just as my consciousness began to fracture into a million irreparable pieces under the violent assault, a heavy, thunderous sound echoed through the veil from the physical world. It was the heavy thud of leather boots against the hospital linoleum. Get away from him, Gideon! A raspy, gravelly voice commanded. It was Abram. My brother had dragged the ancient groundskeeper of St. Jude Cemetery directly into the intensive care unit. The heavy, sharp scent of crushed sage, frankincense, and embalming fluid violently pierced through the sterile, chemical smell of the hospital, reaching all the way down into the astral void. What do you think you are doing? Dr. Eris yelled. Security! Get this man out of my ICU. You chemically severed his tether. Doctor. Abram roared, his voice booming with terrifying, unquestionable authority. He jumped into a lightless, bottomless well to find his mother, and you cut the only rope he had. He isn't in a medical coma. He is being actively consumed by the starving dead. If you don't let me intervene right now, those monitors are going to flatline, and the thing that wakes up in this bed will not be Donovan. I could hear a brief, violent scuffle, followed by the heavy slam of the ICU door. Gideon had physically barricaded Dr. Eris and the nurses outside the room. What do we do, Abram? Gideon panicked. Tell me what to do. We have to purify the vessel. Abram commanded, aggressively unzipping a heavy canvas duffel bag. If we cleanse his physical body, the holy frequency will burn the parasites in the astral realm. Grab that basin of water. Pour the consecrated salt into it. Wash his hands and his forehead. We have to build a shield of pure faith. In the dark void, the parasitic entities violently recoiled. As Gideon's trembling, weeping hands desperately rubbed freezing salt water over my physical face and wrists, a blinding, white-hot shockwave of energy violently detonated in the astral realm. Declan shrieked in absolute agony. shielding his rotting face as the spiritual purification burned his phantom flesh. Lord of the unseen, architect of the veil, we demand a return. Abram began to violently chant, his deep baritone vibrating through the hospital walls, overpowering the frantic pounding of the security guards on the ICU door. This vessel is not abandoned. This flesh is claimed by the living. Break the chains of the ash. Burn the parasites in the dark. No! The horde of dead entities roared, aggressively surging forward, desperate to claim my body before Abram could seal the door. He's flatlining, Gideon screamed in the hospital room, the heart monitor erupting into a long, continuous, deafening screech. The dead were too strong. There were too many of them. Abram's purification was burning them, but my soul was completely exhausted. I was fading. The darkness was violently swallowing the last remnants of my consciousness. Mabel! Abram suddenly roared, his voice echoing directly into the deepest, darkest trenches of the spirit world. Mabel, protect your blood. Your son crossed the veil for you. He gave up his life to see your face. If you love this boy, you must sacrifice the peace of your rest. Come out of the dark and shield your son. The silence in the astral void shattered. A blinding, overwhelmingly warm light violently exploded in the center of the darkness, entirely eradicating the freezing, suffocating cold. She appeared. Mabel did not look like the sickly, exhausted woman who had died in the row house. She did not look like the rotting, burning spirit I had seen in my bathroom ritual. She manifested in her absolute, purest spiritual form, radiant, powerful, and blazing with a fierce, blinding maternal fury. Get away from my son, Mabel's voice boomed, completely overlapping with a terrifying, divine resonance that physically shook the foundations of the astral realm. Declan and the horde of rotting parasites shrieked in sheer terror, violently covering their eyes. They tried to retreat, but Mabel lunged forward. She didn't fight them with violence. She fought them with the overwhelming, burning purity of a mother's absolute love. The sheer frequency of her spiritual light slammed into the dark entities like a massive tidal wave, instantly dissolving their phantom bodies into nothing but harmless gray ash. The void was completely cleared. Mabel turned to me. Her eyes were filled with tears, but this time, they did not burn her skin. She reached out, placing her warm, glowing hands directly against my chest. I told you, Donovan, Mabel whispered, her voice a beautiful, soothing hum that completely eradicated the pain in my soul. You are not allowed to be alone in the dark. Now wake up. Live your life. With one final, massive surge of her own spiritual energy, Mabel violently pushed me upward. I was shot out of the abyss like a bullet fired from a gun. The sensation of re-entering my physical body was a violent, explosive shock of agonizing pain and overwhelming oxygen. My eyes snapped open. I shot up in the hospital bed, violently gasping for air, ripping the oxygen mask off my face. The long, continuous tone of the heart monitor instantly broke, immediately returning to a rapid, erratic, but incredibly strong heartbeat. Donovan! Gideon wept, lunging forward and wrapping his massive arms around my neck, completely collapsing against my chest. I sat there in the sterile, brightly lit ICU, completely drenched in freezing, salty sweat, trembling violently as Dr. Eris and the hospital security finally burst through the barricaded doors. I looked past the chaotic crowd of doctors rushing to my bedside. Standing quietly in the corner of the room, packing his canvas bag, was Abram. He looked at me, gave a slow, solemn nod, and slipped out into the hallway, fading back into the shadows of the living world. I was finally truly free. The heavy, parasitic weight was completely gone from my mind. The dead were gone. It has been 7 years since that night in the Slag Creek Memorial Hospital. I married Jolene 2 years later, and Gideon finally bought a small house of his own outside the city. We never returned to the suffocating confines of that drafty row house. I never attempted the Somnus ritual again. I never read another archaic incantation. Islam, Christianity, and the old root workers all share one absolute, terrifying truth. The rituals that bridge the gap between the living and the dead require rigorous, perfect spiritual purification. When human beings allow blinding grief, raw emotion, and desperate impatience to dictate their actions, they make catastrophic mistakes. They rush into the supernatural world completely unprotected, ignorant of the starving things waiting just behind the veil. Grief is the most dangerous emotion a human can possess. It makes us vulnerable. It makes us desperate enough to open doors that were meant to remain permanently locked. And if you ever find yourself standing in the dark, begging the dirt to give back what it took, you must understand the absolute horrific reality of the universe. Sometimes the dead will answer, and if you aren't strong enough to fight them, they will drag you down to ensure you never have to miss them again.